if the Hindenburg report is true, it's also true that there was massive stock fraud.
Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen. Today is September 15th, and we are happy to bring to you episode 2 of season 2 of The Pirates of Clean Tech. Yar, yar.
Yar.
My yarring is not so good today. I'm Eric Planey.
Hi, I'm Lucas Finko.
And Lucas, do you want to introduce our special guest for this week?
Yes, and we have a special guest. Can you introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Sarah Fitz. I am here enjoying COVID in the beautiful Bronx, and I am a partner at Chip Harden in the Energy Group.
All right, welcome.
Well, fantastic. Glad to have you on board. By the end of the episode, you do have to do a pirate yar. So.
Wait, when do I get my eye patch?
Yeah, Lucas, when do I get my eye patch?
It's in the mail. It's right here. Actually, this is the only one I have, but I keep saying we're going to give it to people.
I've watched prior episodes. I was waiting for them.
You have to give it back at the end of the week. And then
I think Lucas is waiting for our 20th guest so we can order in bulk and get a discount. So we got a ways to go. Anyway, well, everybody, welcome and thank you to our listening audience, both in the YouTube space and also in the podcast world. We're having a blast, and people's feedback have just been getting better and better over the last couple of weeks. We're happy to be back for season 2. Happy to welcome Sarah as our first guest on season 2. And Sarah, why don't you give us a little bit of background, how you ended up in your current position and what your responsibilities are vis-a-vis the world of clean tech?
Sure. So I was at a big law firm a few years ago, and a client started talking to me about Chip Harden, said, well, I maybe back up maybe before that. So that's how I ended up at Chip Harden, because a client started talking about them and said, you know, you should think about moving. But I got there because I started law at a time when, you know, corporate lawyers at law firms were expected to be able to do any transaction. And so I did a whole variety of things coming up as a baby lawyer. I worked, and my first assignment was representing a Japanese company on the Sakhalin gas, oil and gas development right after Perestroika. Actually got sent to Japan for 6 months to work on the business floor as just like the most junior person there. And I worked for the same Japanese company when they built a big power plant in Java, the Paiton power plant. It's a series of electric plants that brought electrification to central Java. And, you know, I worked on financing of rail lines for coal in Brazil, and just a variety of things mixed in with everything else. And, you know, the business of law changed a lot. So as we hit the 2000s, it was clear that professionals were supposed to specialize. And so I really took a look at everything I'd done and also what I felt excited and passionate about, and said, look, I'm an energy and infrastructure lawyer. And so since about 2000, that's really what I've dug in on. Starting with a lot of natural gas CCGT development and then M&A projects around that, and some restructurings, because I was a lawyer during 2010, so everyone was doing restructurings. And more recently, some more CCGT, Japanese investments into CCGT, and just increasing amounts of renewables, because that's where the action is. So,
interesting.
Yeah.
Sarah, can you talk a little bit about your new book and what's that all about?
My new book. I happen to have a copy. I was the editor of this book. This is sort of, you know how career counselors always say yes to opportunity. You know how they say that? That's what happened with this. I was chairing the renewable energy, the name is Renewable Alternative Distributed Energy Resources Committee of the American Bar Association, because lawyers shouldn't be allowed to make names for things. But And I got a phone call from the head of the book committee saying, we haven't found a book for distributed generation on the market yet, and we think it's overdue. So I thought, easy peasy. I've got this committee. It's full of really great, smart people. We'll just do it. So I said yes. And I discovered a lot of things about lawyers. One is that lawyers are terrible with deadlines. And two, a lot of lawyers went to practice law because they didn't want to do academics anymore. So writing articles was painful. So it took like 3 tries to get it right, but we finally did. And it's, the other challenge of a book in this clickbait era is anything that's going to be relevant in print the minute after you print it. So we spent a lot of time on this book thinking not just what's currently important now, but what's going to be relevant a year from now. And so we focused a lot on, I really pushed the writers to include a lot of history, not just where we are, but how we got here, because that should be the same. So I think, and it's got a mix of practitioners and academics. So I think that also helps it strike a balance. But yeah, really, I just had no idea what I was saying yes to when I said it, because this is 3 years of work. And it reminds me of the Michener, the author, his statement that character is measured by what you do on your 3rd and 4th try. Because I feel like I'd get the chapters and I'd go, we can't publish this. And so we'd go back, and it finally came out okay. But I think for people who are interested in distributed generation as practitioners, as well as people who are just interested in the history of the U.S. electric world and how we got from Orchard Street, which, by the way, was a distributed generation system, to where we are now, where we're in some ways trying to recreate Orchard Street, what the route looked like.
Well, shoot, now it sounds like I want to get this book and read it. So if I don't know, if I were teaching a class on distributed generation law, I mean, would your book be my textbook? Is that the idea?
It could be. It's not a textbook in the sense where we say,
well, right.
Here are the 17 elements of the Energy Policy Act that are going to be on the test. Right. We didn't write it like that. We could have, but it would have been incredibly boring. So it's more in context. What's the role of state regulation? What's the role of federal regulation? How does battery storage get regulated? One of the chapters that I think is the most unique in this book is a large chapter on the military's role in distributed generation, because I did not know until I got that chapter that the U.S. Department of Defense is pretty much the world's biggest consumer of energy. And they've been really pushing distributed generation for strategic reasons and for how they're doing their bases in the U.S. and around the world. So, and because it's the Department of Defense, it's, where they go, technology follows. And so I think there's a circle going on there as well.
Yeah, I mean, if you think that these large aircraft carriers have their own nuclear generators on them, I mean, you're talking a lot of energy for the Navy alone, right? So,
right.
Yeah.
And there's some, there's stories that they started using. It's not in the book, but they started. Dennis McGuinn, who used to be head of ACOR and then went into the Obama administration, he tells a story about what solar panels meant to the Afghan deployment when you could, because if you trucked everything in and you set up diesel generators, they were noisy and you had a really dangerous supply chain issue, because what would you like to blow up if you were an insurgent, right? The fuel for the generators. Solar panels could be brought in, they're silent when they're set up, and they don't need to be refueled. So from his perspective, renewable energy saves lives. But he can tell the story better than I can. I'm just telling it secondhand.
Oh, that's fascinating. I guess the question is, when you write a book like this, you've got this kind of convergence of regulation and technology, and it's changing right. So quickly. And also different states and different jurisdictions, even within the United States, have different application of regulations towards distributed. Do you focus in your book on kind of best practices approach first and foremost?
A little bit. When we so much changed when we first got the call to start this book and when it came out, but it became really clear to us that this was going to be state driven and that the states varied a lot. It's hard to say what best practices are because this is still new from a regulatory perspective, but it's absolutely true that there's a huge variation, which is kind of interesting in a nerdy, geeky way, because we'll actually be able to sit back and say, well, that worked in Minnesota, but this didn't work in Ohio. Aha! But if you were actually like a developer who wanted to do projects, it's just shoot me. It's just really complicated and expensive, and there's a lot of uncertainty, and it's slowing things down. So it will be nice to have federal leadership again someday, but for now, it's definitely the role of the states. And backing up from that, so on a regulatory perspective, speaking to overgeneralize but not be wrong, if I'm selling an electron in a system that gets sold in interstate commerce, then it's a federally regulated thing. So that's when the FERC weighs in. In theory, if I'm selling distributed generation, my electron doesn't go into the interstate grid. So historically, it's been regulated at a state level. Now, we all know that electrons travel along the path of least resistance on the wires that are all connected to each other, so you have no assurance that your electron won't end up in interstate commerce, but we'll go with the fiction.
It works for me. Do you think, even just taking it back a step in terms of regulation and technology, do you think most of the country is on board with distributed energy philosophically? Because, there's...
I don't think most of the country has a clue what we're talking about.
Still.
Because there's... People understand what renewable energy is and what, fossil energy is. But a big utility scale solar panel, or a solar panel inside of a big utility scale array is the same as a gas plant from a regulatory perspective in many ways. It's not distributed, it's regulated as it by many of the same rules that cover that giant gas plant. Whereas a distributed generation, so to back up for people who aren't total energy nerds, when I say distributed, what I mean is the local distribution grid. So you have your big gas plant, it's connected to high voltage wires that bring it, across state lines to another location. Then you've seen them by the road, the substations. So a science person will explain this better, but the voltage, the waves are stepped down. Then it's brought to a neighborhood and it's stepped down again. And then it's circulated. We're talking about that. We're talking about those smaller, lower voltage, closed systems that are kind of linked to the interstate grid, but not transporting on the interstate grid. So I don't think that's, we say easy as turning on a light all the time, which I think just shows that people have no clue how hard it is to turn on a light when you think about all of the technology that enables that flip of the switch to work 99.99999% of the time, right? It's not easy at all. It's really hard. So I don't think people know. I think people like the idea of solar panels on their houses. I think people are intrigued by the idea of having your own batteries. I don't think people think about the fact that those are regulated very differently than solar panels that are part of a big array.
Interesting. Okay. You want to transition to our articles? I'm sure we'll get much more insight out of Sarah.
Yeah, actually, it's kind of funny when Sarah was speaking, the articles that we chose just by happenstance, a lot of them are very appropriate for Sarah's expertise and this conversation. So the timeliness of having you on is pretty good.
Good.
Yeah.
I'd love to say that we planned that, but we're just really not that smart. So, okay, so Clean Technia, one of our favorite publications, September 8th, Tina Casey. Again, in season 1, we talked a lot about the hydrogen revolution. And I say revolution because, in the US, we weren't talking about hydrogen. Now all of a sudden it's conversation du jour. But really good article called Trickle of Green Hydrogen Turns into Flood of Good News for Renewables. And I just like this story because, once again, we're talking about different applications of hydrogen that kind of blow my mind away in terms of hydrogen is only being talked about in the most part in public about a transportation fuel. That's hydrogen fuel cells for smaller vehicles, maybe larger fuel cell systems for commercial vehicles and marine fleet. That was something that was making the headlines on occasion in the US when maybe a technology provider like an automotive OEM came to market with something creative and innovative. This here is talking about how green hydrogen is coming into source in kind of a more of a commercial and industrial application. They talked about this Infinite Blue Energy, which I think is a European firm, how they're actually going to create a larger fuel cell system to provide power at kind of the power plant or commercial industrial level. And, you know, using truly green sources to create that hydrogen, either, you know, wind or solar. What I like about this, again, is we're talking about a lot of different technology that is interconnected in terms of making the hydrogen and in terms of its exportability or applicability in shipping hydrogen, either in a gas state or a liquid state. So this is a really good article for us to just increase our knowledge base on the application for hydrogen. It raises a couple questions for me. I think if we need to tackle you know, the 2 degrees centigrade increase in climate by 2050, sometimes I feel like we're going in so many different directions that we're not being coordinated either globally or in terms of technology. And that's one thing about this article that started getting me thinking was, you know, are we looking at so many different solutions for something like green hydrogen that we're spending a lot of precious resource and capital expenditure on something that may or may not work? Again, these are, you know, it's worth having that argument, that debate. But I do like the fact that we're looking at, you know, application for hydrogen just beyond transportation. So, you know, it could lead to better maybe return on investment for a lot of people. So I don't know what you guys think about it, but I thought it was a fascinating article. Once again, we're talking hydrogen.
Yeah, I think this is great. You know, they talk a little bit about blue hydrogen here. So just be careful about that because there's a little bit of a greenwash. And so they want their solution to be totally green hydrogen, which means they use renewable energy to produce their hydrogen. They don't use natural gas. However, I do like hydrogen as a solution, both for transportation, like you said, and for energy storage. And I think that's one of the reasons why you see a wind farm being built in a hydrogen article, as it works great for storage. And also it can be sort of burned in a, you know, underutilized natural gas plant, because when you burn hydrogen and oxygen, the output is water and energy. So it's a much cleaner way to generate energy using electricity, using existing technology that may be kind of obsolete in a renewable future. So very good to see more development along these lines.
Yeah, so I'll add that a few years ago I worked with Toyota when they were exploring putting their chain of hydrogen fueling stations in the Northeast, which you know, is going to eventually have to be a demand, not supply driven, but it was a proof of concept. The technology for converting different substances to hydrogen, it's been around for a long time. I'm sure it's being improved, but it never penciled economically. So you'd spend more energy to create the hydrogen than you would get from burning the hydrogen. So it was always kind of like one of the scenes in Back to the Future when when the professor comes back and he throws a bunch of trash into his car and then takes off again. You know, it was always, that idea was always there, but it was just hard to pencil. What makes this renewable energy bit kind of interesting, and it's not surprising that we're seeing coming out of Germany, is that of what you're using to create the energy to create your hydrogen is renewables that you would have not dispatched because you've overbuilt them. Then all of a sudden your question about the energy not penciling really changes. And the question about how much capacity can I build for my wind farms, or, you know, do I have to power off my wind farm when demand doesn't match, sort of creates an interesting opportunity where even if the hydrogen isn't really economic on a standalone basis, if you're main inputs are water and electricity that you're generating with no fuel cost, and would have just either been shed or not generated at all. It's a different conversation.
I was going to say, yeah, Sarah, that's great perspective. And I've definitely seen Asian countries really focusing on hydrogen over the years, much more than others.
The other place that there was a lot of talk about hydrogen was for use of places where you wouldn't want combustion for safety reasons, like warehouses indoors. So there's already, like, it's not glamorous, so that's why it's not in the press, but there's a whole market for like hydrogen powered forklifts for inside of warehouses where you don't really want your employees breathing the fumes from the gasoline powered forklifts that they might have used instead. And the electric powered forklifts, which are also common indoors, are fine, but they're harder to recharge. So it has those kinds of applications as well.
Yeah, I worked at a warehouse that had gasoline fired forklifts. Ironically, it was a company that did bicycle parts,
Yep.
and I was breathing in fumes from that. And so you're absolutely 100% right. I thought it was a great story. I think, again, the conversation about hydrogen in this article is only about hydrogen. I would like to see some comparisons on relative value, especially when you're talking about storage of hydrogen versus, declining prices of lithium ion, for example, for traditional energy storage or what we think about as energy storage. So it's a great article, great conversation stimulator, but there's a lot more that has to get solved about hydrogen, and we in the Pirates are going to make that happen, we think.
Yeah. Another analog for the Pirates to keep an eye on is dealing with just the amount of waste. And a separate problem that needs to be solved is disposal of waste from water systems and from trash into waste yards. And so it may not be hydrogen, but gasification may have other solutions as well.
Very good. No, totally understood. So it was a good story. I think this one is worth talking about. So since Lucas and I are in a constant touche with each other on, in a competitive, loving way, last week he did a local story from a New Jersey radio station. So I had to go back to my hometown paper, the Youngstown Vindicator, which, full disclosure, every now and then I write an op-ed in there, probably every 6-7 months. So happy to talk about the Vindicator. It's always been a part of my life since childhood. They had a great story. GM's electric vehicles debuting a wireless system. And we're going to tie this to another story, but General Motors, who I'm definitely bullish on, and I own a couple shares, I have to say, again, full disclosure. They're in my hometown in Ohio. We've talked about the fact that they, along with LG, are building a battery facility right next door to a former auto factory of General Motors. So they kind of lived up to their promise when they closed the auto factory that they would be back, and certainly they are. So they've come out with something they call the Ultimum Propulsion System for its electric models. And this is kind of like the basis and foundation for the battery cells, which will be produced outside of Youngstown. Developed along with a Massachusetts company, I believe, called Analog Devices. This new system is going to allow GM to power several types of electric vehicles from a common set of battery components. What I like about what GM is doing here, and this just can be extrapolated not just from the battery systems, but to the vehicles themselves, they're really looking at EV production across a myriad of different models and brands in almost a modular type of way. And so first off, it's good for GM to keep their costs down. That's something that has to take place in order to bring the cost of electric vehicles down altogether, so that there's kind of a parity in pricing between an equivalent ICE vehicle, an internal combustion engine, and a lithium-ion battery charged vehicle. So this type of common core unit, as they call it, Ultimum, is just another way in which General Motors is putting, a century plus of engineering prowess into next generation vehicle technology. So I'm really happy to see this. I think, again, I give complete credit to Elon Musk and Tesla for being the catalyst to get the BMWs and the General Motors and the Toyotas and Hondas thinking harder and faster about EV technology. And now GM is finally looking at ways in a very smart commercial return-oriented basis to bring mass electric vehicle production to the public. So I like this a lot. should I put this in context with the next article, or should we talk about this one now?
Well, I'd like to talk about this one a little bit because
Yeah.
I did have to look this up. So this battery management system, it literally has a wire that runs to every tiny cell in these batteries in these cars. So in case you don't know, when they build these giant battery packs, they use tiny cells like little D-cell batteries, and they pack like thousands of them together into this pack. And that makes up the pack that goes into your EV. So they have a wire to each one of those. I mean, this could be thousands of wires. You know, I was confused by this. They said saving up to 90% of the wiring and 15% of the volume of the battery pack. That just seems massive to me for wires. So there could be thousands of wires that they're going to get rid of. So this was really interesting. It not only cuts down on the weight and the volume and the cost. I mean, this is really cool.
Yeah, I echo that. It's cool. It's it's classic manufacturing improvement.
Yeah, it really is. So I'm a fan of GM, always have been, and I think the Fords, the Chryslers, and their parent company, everyone is looking the right direction about improving EV technology. So all of a sudden, it's not a premium pricing. So I'm happy about that. Now, I'm tying this to another story because GM was in the news last week for making a substantial investment into the, let's say, controversial company called Nikola. Nikola is the Tesla competitor, and I say that with a small c because they're really looking at commercial vehicles, large-scale trucks, but they're talking about a hydrogen fuel cell model. And so it was big news when Nikola was receiving a $2 billion investment from General Motors on vehicle production collaboration in exchange for General Motors getting access to Nikola's fuel cell technology. And then it became controversial because Hindenburg Research published a lengthy report last week. And we should say this is a Barron story called Nikola's Stock Keeps Falling After Short Seller Calls Its Technology into Question, written by Max Cherney and Al Root on September 11th. There's reports out there that Nikola is a little bit of a house of cards in terms of being a little bit forward on their technology development, maybe not being as transparent, maybe as presenting vehicles that are completed, when some of the technology isn't necessarily theirs. And I think there's a couple of things here. First off, we can't make an opinion one way or the other because we don't have enough information to know. I believe General Motors, when they came out with a statement saying that they did their due diligence, they're not going to spend $2 billion, especially this current management regime who's so good at being very, very protective of their investment dollars, knowing it's their shareholders. So they made an investment and they said they did do their due diligence. But it's funny, about 3 weeks ago, I watched the movie Tucker from the 80s. I don't know if you ever watched that movie, about, a gentleman who took on Big Detroit in making, this incredible vehicle that had all these world-class safety standards back in the 1950s. And, he made his first one in the back of his garage with a bunch of engineering buddies. And that first model that they rolled out was beautiful. And it definitely didn't have all the technical solutions that they promised. But by the time they came out to their production model, it did have those. So there is something to be said. I think startup OEMs, especially entrepreneurs, will probably cut a few corners in presentation, but generally they come through at the end with the technology follow through. So I'm not a shareholder in Nikola. I'm not part of this incredible wave of electric vehicle stocks and SPAC issuances taking place. I do think that this is interesting. I think it's something we need to keep on following. But I think there's going to be a lot of criticism. Elon Musk received a lot of criticism, and he generally proves the naysayers incorrect. And this could be a very similar case. So I'd be happy to get both of your perspectives on this.
I did read the Hindenburg Research report. There were some outrageous things in there. They did talk about a video that Nikola put together of their semi-truck, like the one pictured here, with a trailer rolling down a highway in the middle of nowhere. And it definitely made it look like they had a production-ready functional vehicle. And it turns out that whole thing was filmed on this like 5-mile long road with a tiny grade to it that you can't detect. And that actually Hindenburg Research took their Honda CRV down there, put it in neutral and it rolled like 2 miles. It got up to 50 miles an hour. So, I mean, I understand what you're saying. In Nikola's defense, every startup starts like this, right? You have ideas, you have IP, you have something new you want to do, and at some stage, it's in some stage of development, right? And you can't get anybody to do a deal with you unless they believe that it's real, right? And it's going to happen. So in many ways, it's kind of like this concept of creation, right? How do you create things and how messy is it? And you might not really understand how messy it is until you actually try to do it. So I can see that side of it too. So it's still really interesting to see this battle playing out. I don't know, Sarah?
Yeah, so if the Hindenburg report is true, it's also true that there was massive stock fraud. So I read that and there would be a lot of people who would have had to be in it. So you have to bear in mind the number of accountants and auditors and lawyers and board members and so on who would have had to have been in cahoots with Nikola to cover this up. So that immediately, I generally, even though current events may prove me wrong, I generally don't believe in conspiracies because I don't actually think most people can pull them off. It's
Good
really
point.
my lack of faith in people that makes me think conspiracies are unlikely. But
I love that attitude.
But GM has come out again and said that they believe the technology is there. Nikola's reportedly been in to speak with the SEC. We haven't heard about charges being filed. So, I'd watch one short seller writing a nasty report. I'd pay attention because there was one analyst who called Enron years before everyone else. But I also think, I think you need to go slow.
Thank you. I think that's very well said. I would add one quick final point is that, when GM made this investment, obviously I think they wanted to play a little bit of catch up or hedging on modern hydrogen technology. But bear in mind, about 10, 12 years ago, GM was the one that introduced a hydrogen fuel cell modular platform at one of the auto shows. It was kind of a skateboard structure, if I recall correctly. So I think GM has enough base knowledge on hydrogen fuel cell, and obviously electric vehicle technology that their due diligence would have uncovered any type of glaring oversight by Nikola. So I guess we'll see this play out, but it's just something I thought, a couple readers actually emailed me last week and asked for our opinion on this. And so I guess here it is, back by popular demand.
I mean, I could make another defense for them too. Like, this is a beautiful truck, man. And I mean, there's plenty of geeky guys like me who are STEM, who can go build things and make things work. I feel like there are a lot less people that can make something beautiful and people that can market and get it out and get people to want to buy something. I just feel like that's a more difficult thing to have as a company. So you could say, from my point of view, they're doing an awesome job as a company, right? Just getting people to want to buy this.
Yeah, well said. Well said. All right, so okay. I have one last story, and I think we're gonna combine it a little bit with Lucas's first story because there's a little bit of an overlap, and this is where having Sarah on board for this week is just incredibly beneficial and fruitful for us because we're starting to get a little bit into controversy, and this also dovetails with a story that Lucas covered last week about New Jersey, where New Jersey was thinking about, quote, going it alone, unquote, for various reasons in the electricity markets. This is out of another great publication, Green Tech Media. This is from September 9th, written by Jeff St. John. FERC order may undermine renewables, energy storage in New York's capacity markets. And the subheadline, another setback for clean energy resources heightens tension in states considering alternatives to federally regulated markets. And I think it's a very important subheadline. So this article here is obviously the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission rejected a proposal from New York's grid operator called NISO to allow renewable energy and batteries to compete against traditional fossil fuel methods in its wholesale capacity markets. And I'll let Lucas talk a little bit more about just what wholesale capacity markets are. He's better at it than I am. But this is what I would say a must read in the energy. If you're in energy and utility business and the regulatory business, I think it is a must read because we're starting to have a little bit of a confrontation that seems to be growing and growing between local grid operators who want to put newer renewable sources of energy and storage into their operating capacity and making it commercially viable by being able to use wholesale capacity markets to move that electricity from those sources. And the FERC is denying it right now. Now, you can say what you will, and we try to keep politics out as much as possible. We try to look at things objectively, but you have to wonder and question, why would FERC want to actually put the kibosh onto bringing storage and renewables for NISO? As you know, we talked about last week, New York has some very, very aggressive renewable energy targets. They want 70% of their renewable energy generation by 2030, and they want zero emissions. They want 100% by 2040. In order to get there, they're talking about gigawatts of distributed solar, gigawatts of offshore wind, and even gigawatts of energy storage. I think 3 gigawatts of energy storage by 2030. So they actually feel that they need FERC to approve of renewable energy on the wholesale capacity markets in order for them to meet those mandates. Where the controversy is and where FERC has to worry, and I'm paraphrasing our pre-conversation with Lucas, if we don't get FERC approval, or if NISO does not get FERC approval, they may start talking about just going it alone and going around federally regulated markets. And then all of a sudden you're introducing an element of risk that has, generally been kept away from interstate power generation and transmission. And, I don't think at this moment in time when we're so focused on bringing renewables into the grid across the nation that we have to have this type of controversy. So I'd like to get both Sarah and Lucas's opinion because I think this is really something that's going to be a hot topic, not just in New York, but in other states where FERC may have resistance.
Yeah, I mean, I can talk a little bit, to answer your question. So wholesale markets generally, I think in NISO is about at the 2 megawatt level. So if you have a 2 megawatt generator or battery or solar panel installation, you're generally assumed to be in the wholesale market, not in the retail market, which means you have to run a transmission line, you have to connect to the New York transmission grid, and you have to deal with wholesale rules like the FERC and NISO setup. You don't have to work with your local utility, say Con Ed or National Grid or NYSEG or something like this. If you're smaller than that, then you're deemed on the distribution grid and you have to call your local utility to get connected. So that would be the difference between the wholesale and the distributed grid, which is what Sarah talked about a little earlier. And yeah, I mean, these numbers are huge, right? 3 gigawatts of solar, 9 gigawatts of wind, 3 gigawatts of energy storage. These are huge. And, to get these with distributed, say in your home, you have maybe a 10 kilowatt battery, right? So you're talking to get to 3 gigawatts, you're talking, if my math is right, 300,000 of these have to be installed in people's driveways or people's garages or parking lots or what have you. So that's kind of hard to get to. It might make a lot more sense to put, a large energy storage project in, which means it would have to connect to the wholesale grid. And then in order for them to get compensated, they would have to be in these capacity markets so that they can get paid for the services they're providing to the grid. And right now they're blocking that. And that's what this is all about. Sarah can correct me if I'm wrong. So yeah, so this is creating a little bit of a speed bump on the way to these renewable energy goals. So we'll talk in my article next about some of the plans to mitigate this. I don't know, Sarah, can you add more here?
Yeah, there's a lot to add, but it's pretty nerdy. But I think the thing to remember is that if you have a 2 megawatt battery and you put it in Queens or someplace in an urban area, what makes that project, which is a really expensive project to build for 2 megawatts, financeable, is that it can play in both the distributed generation world by being connected to the Con Ed grid, and it can play in the capacity market just because of its technology. So just the kind of thing that really disturbs energy purists is it can get paid both for demand response and for capacity at the same time on the same piece of technology. But that's one of the things that's interesting about it. So what this essentially does, because of the cost of batteries, is they won't clear. And so what New York State had tried to do is so there's basically a two-part rule to clear in the New York wholesale market. You have to be favorably placed against both the cost of the ICAP market, the installed capacity resources, and the cost of new entrants. And the baseline measure for that is your natural gas-fired power plant. So your new battery is going to cost more than that, and the electricity would be more expensive than the gas. So New York had essentially wanted to give some good citizenship points to the batteries and other renewable energy-based assets based on this public policy you mentioned and what New York State wants to encourage. What the FERC said is you can't use non-economic signals. That's not fair. You're discriminating against fossil. So on its face, you could say, oh, well, they're just energy purists. But really, there was little to no opposition in New York for this proposal. So you have to look beyond it and say, well, there's something else going on. And it's really this constant chipping away at the ability to expand renewables at the expense of gas. And whether that's political or whether it's just philosophical, I'm not sure. There was the case that FERC rejected, fortunately, in New England, challenging net metering a couple of weeks ago. And I happen to know one of the people involved in this case. He was just an energy purist. He just was bothered by this. And famously so. So, it's hard to know because it's complicated, but the immediate impact is that it will be much harder to develop, build, and finance battery storage in New York. And so then just on a related issue, you live in New York City, so you know that we've got all of these peakers around the city. Part of the plan is to replace those with batteries because they're in economically, I don't know what the right term is for it now, but they're in environmental justice neighborhoods with high childhood asthma. And if you could have the same benefits of replacing a diesel-fired plant that only fires up 35 days a year anyway with an array of batteries, why wouldn't you do that, even if it costs more? And that's the kind of project that people are thinking about that is really severely challenged by this proposal.
You mentioned it'll be troublesome for New York based on this ruling, but really it's going to be for all states because all states now are going to have a fear factor, and financiers are going to have a fear factor that going forward, batteries of 2 megawatt plus are just not going to be not have the ability to sell into different markets because of the FERC rules.
Right.
It really
you'll see them in like C&I. So campuses will still want them, universities will still want them. You may want them because you can use them for Black Start and for other features, but what they won't be able to do is to clear reliably into the wholesale market, and so those capacity payments for all the times that they're not clearing are not going to be available to them, and that's what's going to impact the economics.
Right. So I think this is this is something that hit my radar, even though I'm more of a novice compared to Lucas and Sarah on this. It's something we have to follow and talk about because, it could be that this all changes on November 4th, with a potential election that favors Democrats and maybe a different philosophy. We don't know that for sure, but obviously I think it would change the conversation.
Yeah, I think Sarah pointed out that earlier to me that there are 2 FERC commissioners that are that have been nominated but not approved. So if there's a different administration in November or January, that could change, right? Very quickly.
Yeah, so he nominated, let me find their names in case any of your listeners know anything about them. Allison Clement and Mark Christie. they haven't gone in front of the Senate yet.
Okay. Well, that's good.
I'm willing to bet they're not from former solar CEOs, right?
No. Allison Clement, who's the Democrat, is actually Chuck Schumer's choice, though.
Okay.
Interesting.
But I don't know. I didn't go further to research about their record.
Cool. All right. Well, Lucas, you have a potential solution here, right, for your article?
Yeah. So great. We can launch into my 2 articles for this week. This first one's from Utility Drive. This is by Robert Walton. FERC rejection of NISO renewables plan could prompt state-managed capacity markets, advocate says. It says here the commission's lone Democrat dissented, saying FERC has perverted the New York ISO's buyer-side market power mitigation rules to slow the state's clean energy transition. So this is one of the solutions being proposed. We saw in your GTM article, I think it was, where'd it go now? New Jersey, Maryland, Illinois. We already covered New Jersey last week. They're all considering the same thing. So if the FERC is going to make rules that are against my state's plans to expand renewable energy, I'll just alter my system so that FERC doesn't have jurisdiction, right? And so again, it's great that we have Sarah here to help us with this, because I mean, like, well, what do I have to do? Do I have to cut all the transmission lines at my state? I mean, we were talking about ERCOT, which is the RTO in Texas. I mean, it really is a question of how far does New York have to go to pull this back?
The Brexit of the power world. Yeah, I think, New York is already a single state ISO, so I think it has been able to do statewide planning in a way that other states haven't. I think they just put that on steroids.
Yeah, so they already have their own ISO, right? And that was my question.
Yeah. But, I looked at a deal a few years ago for a plant that was going to be built in West Virginia, but it hasn't been. But, one of the things they were selling is that it was in a state that wasn't a market-based rate state, but could sell into PJM with a pretty short transmission line. So other states are already doing this. And power plants will just figure out a way to arbitrage it.
Well, but what's stopping, say, the New York Public Service Commission, which is the utility regulator, and the NISO from just stepping aside and saying, hey, we're going to redesign our capacity markets using state rules?
At the New York, it's a lot of work, and why would you want to do it? It reduces redundancy, it reduces options. So, it's why pull out of Europe? I mean, I suppose it's a philosophical, practical question.
I guess so. You're getting me both thinking about, when Cuomo is putting this plan together, right? The whole thing is about taking clean energy produced in mid-state or upstate and, turning off, fossil fuel generation that's mainly down in Long Island and the city itself. So I guess the question is and I don't know this, but it's easy to speculate that maybe a lot of these projects that are coming to bear probably aren't as reliant on wholesale capacity markets to generate a market return for the project, because they're already dedicated to, turning off the fossil fuel switch in New York. Like, they already have a dedicated revenue stream that may be beyond or outside of the wholesale capacity markets versus say a project in the middle of the US or in the Southwest that would need wholesale capacity markets as a revenue source to generate.
From a project finance perspective, it's very fraught to try to develop a large asset without a power purchase agreement in place anyway.
Right.
So if you're looking, and it's very hard to have a PPA, especially when it goes more than a few years, for most any energy asset except for campus and industrial, which I think is why that segment's so popular. So, the CCGT plants that were built recently, meaning in the last 10 years, they relied on capacity payments or short-term PPAs, but to get bank financing, but it was hard, and many attempted projects never saw the light of day. The NYSERDA folks who are advising Cuomo know this sort of stuff better than anyone on planet Earth. So I'm suspecting they may be looking at this and saying, we're not going to get the level of renewables we want without PPAs and without a capacity market that's reliably available. So we're going to have to think about something else.
Okay. Well,
Wow.
a lot to think about here. So,
What do you think? What was that wow for, Lucas?
You have a lot of confidence in the NYSERDA people.
What? That might be true.
In my experience, the NISO people tend to be very good and know this stuff very well. So those are the
my
people I call.
experience with the NYSERDA people has been really positive too. And they have they're good at plucking people out of other places for a few years, taking a brain drain from them and then putting them back out in the public. So there's some, and I know people worry about industry capture and going in and out, but for something that's meant to be innovative,
Right.
recycling people like that can be a very positive thing, and NYSERDA does that very well.
Right. I don't mean to disparage NYSERDA. I think they're very good at what's in their name, which is R&D, right?
Yeah, they're an
I don't
R&D,
think
but
they're great at markets.
yeah, they may not be, but they may not be at the market part, but they understand the financing part.
yeah, I
Right.
think
And so I'm more on the deal and transaction side rather than on the trading side. So that's the part where my brain went.
Well, they have the Green Bank, right? So obviously they're good.
Big
On the
bank, and
finance.
they're just regularly bringing good people in.
Yeah.
well, that's a good one. So, Lucas, you have one more, I believe, right?
Yeah, one more here. So some good news. We did have some good news on the hydrogen front and the EV front. So this one from New Jersey Spotlight News again. I don't know, for some reason I'm biased for New Jersey. This from Tom Johnson, who's the energy environment writer. Offshore wind in New Jersey gets a boost, but lawmakers demand a halt to one project. So this was interesting. This is from September 10th. The regulator in New Jersey called the BPU approves another step needed to build a massive production facility in South Jersey. So they're moving forward with this large, massive wind farm production facility in Southern Jersey. Here's one under construction. I don't know if this is the one in New Jersey, but okay, that's from Creative Commons, so it's not clear. But so they cleared another hurdle on the way to making this New Jersey offshore wind sector a reality. But sadly, they did take one tiny little step back. Just 3 assemblymen wrote a letter asking the BPU to halt the one and only offshore wind project that's approved by the state. This is one by Ørsted. It's going to be 15 miles off Atlantic City. I believe it has 2 phases, so it starts small and then it gets big. Part of the approval was that Ørsted would, invest in this port and help bring jobs and revenue to the area. They've stated that they're fully committed to this project, to bringing these revenues and bringing the activity to New Jersey. They're well on their way, they say, to carefully and mindfully delivering our almost $700 million in state spend commitment. So I thought that was a little interesting. I don't know, I haven't read the letter, so it'd be interesting to see why they asked them to halt. I think it's maybe just a little nudge to get them to move forward with the projects a little faster. But this is good. So they put out a solicitation. They're asking for over 1,000 megawatts. So this is great, 1,200 to 2,400 megawatts of offshore wind, which we'd all love to see and would really help New Jersey move towards renewable energy.
Yeah, I think the concerns were around MWBE, minority women business enterprise hiring and union labor, so I think it's going to be a question. I think it may be an effort to get more local hiring.
Yeah. Okay, I see.
Which personally I'm all in favor of, and as a Republican who's turned very moderate lately, I'm actually in favor. I think a lot of the unions here are very cooperative with these large-scale developments lately. So it's a win-win to bring people to the table quicker and sooner. And it seems like everyone's more cooperative lately.
So I don't know any of the background, but it's a frequent conversation, and it's also consistent with other discussions going on at the time about social justice. And so I'm guessing it's all related to that. And I think you'll frequently hear it when you talk to people in the trades that the companies that they'd hire that would meet the MWVE requirements don't exist yet. So then the question is what do we need to do to launch them?
Right.
Yeah. And they also mentioned that they have $6 million in workplace training programs.
Right.
For these companies. So it looks like they have a plan and everybody needs to do their part, and they're just maybe having some coordination issues.
Well, I think what you're going to find, because it seems to be universally the case, but this is just spitballing, is what we're going to need is some seed capital.
Interesting. Putting it on investors. Okay.
To start the companies that would meet the WMBE qualification requirements, because there aren't enough companies of that type that would qualify yet.
Well, we need also people to start companies that request seed investment, right?
Yeah. Well, you can cover this on another Pirates issue, but investing into minority-owned companies and women-owned companies. A lot of articles there's a lot of talk about how it's less than it could be. But that's for a future episode of yours.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
I'm not an expert in it at all, but it's something frequently when I'm responding to an RFP, one of the things I'm doing is getting on the phone and looking for the people who could fill that 15% slot and finding it hard to, not that there aren't good people out there, because I've found them, but there's not enough of them. And they're, by the time I've called them, they've already signed on to another team or something.
Right.
So.
Well, there's an opportunity there for somebody, and we can certainly talk more about that. But I thought it was a great article, very optimistic, which we certainly need. So, we had a couple controversial articles, a couple fun ones, and fantastic conversation with Sarah and learning more. Sarah, talk a little bit more about your book. Where can we find it? How can you order it?
Okay.
Website?
It's only available right now through the American Bar Association. But if you go to the ABA website, you'll be able to find it in the shop section.
So we can include a link in the
I'll send it to
section for the podcast and the YouTube.
Yeah. It's realizing because, for example, even like this week's NISO chapter, or the NISO article highlights why it was so hard to write this, because it'd be done, and then I remember calling up the person who wrote the California chapter. It's like, "Hi, sister, you got more work." and we'd already submitted page proofs when that New England case on distributed on demand response was up, and I was like, one, it would be terrible if the firm took this case, but two, we've already submitted page proofs and the battery's wrong. So I'm expecting we're going to need to do a second edition in a couple of years. So
absolutely,
we missed this time around, but it really is a moving target, and that's, I think, what makes this area so interesting.
Yeah,
agreed.
Cool.
Well, listen, it was great having you as a guest. I think you elevated the pilot, and we'll definitely put a link to the website for your book, and hope to see you in future podcasts.
Thank you.
That's great. Well, that was fun. Again, this was episode 2 of Pirates of Clean Tech. Lucas, you want to talk a little bit more about where people can find us and how they can subscribe?
Yeah, sure. You can find us at your favorite podcast site. We're on most podcast sites. We're multicast. Just search for Pirates of Clean Tech, and you can click the follow button, and then you'll get notifications when our new episode comes up. We're also on YouTube if you want to see our beautiful faces, which I recommend. And you can click subscribe. And then you also have to hit the little bell icon, and then you'll get a notification on your phone like I do when our episodes are up, which I highly recommend. And you can leave us a comment too. There'll probably be less jokes about my hair now that I got my COVID haircut, but you never know. So
I think there should be a joke about the fact that you have a notification given the fact that you post to the YouTube page. I think I could run with that one for a couple weeks.
I need to know. I don't.
Well, anyways, on Twitter we are at Clean Pirates. We're trying to stay up to date with that, and also check our YouTube page out for our newest segment, which is electric vehicle and car reviews. So we're having a lot of fun here. And I'm going to do one quick shout out here. As we were talking, I got a great email. As many of you know, I'm on the board of directors of the City Parks Foundation. Part of our mandate is to educate children in diverse communities in New York City about climate change, using the parks in New York as a laboratory. And we just found out that our Green Girls program, which is sponsored by ING Bank, was awarded the 2020 Climate Change Learning Award by the National Summer Learning Association. This prestigious award recognizes outstanding programs that educate and empower young people on climate change and encourage them to become environmental stewards in their communities. So shout out to my friends at the City Parks Foundation, to Chrissy and Heather and the team. And more information there is cityparksfoundation.org. And before we sign out, we do have to say that the views and opinions expressed by the Pirates and our guests are those of ourselves and not necessarily those of any organization that we represent. Well, thanks, Sarah. Appreciate having you on. And with that, we are the Pirates of Clean Tech.
Yar.
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 Yar. Yes. It's not a complete episode until the guest does the yar.
That's right.